Happy New Year, everybody. Glad to be together to start another semester. We're going to have a couple hours together featuring a keynote speaker that I will be introducing shortly. But I wanted to cue up that introduction in the following way. In the 5 years that I have been here, this is my 11th semester doing a Flex Opener, a President's Open, and never in any of those 11 Flex Openers have we ever had an external speaker as a keynote. So you'll know that this is a special event and a special day and a very special speaker that we feel warranted doing something that we don't normally do. So before I introduce Dr. Garcia to you all, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to provide a few acknowledgments. We have amongst us the Chancellor, Chancellor Barnes, thank you for being here. President of the Board, Tim Jamal. Trustees, Milchiker, Rydell, Inman, thank you so much. President of the Academic Senate, Margot Lovett, thank you all for being here. Thank you, classified professionals, for taking time in your day to be here. Thank you for faculty who have syllabi to write for taking time to be here and writing those syllabi tonight instead. We appreciate that. And thank you to managers for taking time out of what is a busy time for you all to be here as well. We're very excited to be here for this reason, to hear from Dr. Garcia. Following Dr. Garcia's presentation, we'll have a very brief Q&A. We'll have some remarks from President of the Academic Senate, Dr. Lovett. I'll come back and wrap things up. If at any time you need to go, you know where the restrooms are. We're not going to take an intermission per se, but please feel free to come and go as you like. Allow me to say a few words about Dr. Garcia. Dr. Garcia is a professor at the School of Education at UC Berkeley. Looks like we got 2 mics going there. Let's just have one. She is the leading researcher in the country on HSIs, which is a very important thing to us. The reality is that we didn't become an HSI a few years ago because we wanted the brand for marketing. We became an HSI because we wanted to be able to focus on helping a minoritized population in our community that was growing faster than any other segment of our community. We recognized, and we will talk about some of that data today, that that portion of our community that identifies as Latino, Latina is the fastest growing segment of our population and will at some point become the majority of our population. So what school could possibly think that they could be around for the future if not prepared to support and facilitate the success of our Latino, Latina students? So very important that we all recognize that our status as an HSI was always about something more than being able to put it on our website or to use it in marketing, which you'll notice we don't do a lot of, by the way. So Dr. Garcia's work is in this exact area. It is in this area of helping HSIs understand who they are, helping them embrace their identity, helping them support students and not just see their identity as a branding item, but as something that helps identify their purpose, their mission, and tying that to their own core values and what they want to do in terms of facilitating social justice in our society and equity in our society. Her work in this area has been hallmarked by editing and serving as the author of major textbooks, including Becoming HSIs, HSIs in Practice, Defining Servingness at HSIs, a concept that she coined, servingness, and you'll hear more about that today. And from just this last year, her latest book, Transforming HSIs for Equity and Justice. Dr. Garcia earned her bachelor's from CSUN, her master's from University of Maryland, her PhD in educational leadership, organizational change from UCLA. And she was, by the way, of some interest to some of you I know, formerly a Title V coordinator at CSU Fullerton, the greatest destination college for more of our students than any others. So please join me in giving a very warm Saddleback welcome to Dr. Gina Garcia.
Well, hello. Hello, good afternoon. Buenos dias. Buenas tardes. I guess it's afternoon, yeah. I do want to acknowledge that the front row was with me at IVC, and they traveled with me because they love the presentation so much, right? So I'm going to call them my fan club now, the distinguished guests in the front. So thank you all for coming to hear me again, and thank you all for being here for this conversation. Thank you also for the sort of context around why this conversation is important, because I think we need to have this conversation. I think about this topic often, all the time. It's my area of research. But not all campuses that have now reached this HSI status are thinking about it actively or regularly, besides sometimes maybe a few people on campus. Typically your HSI Title V folks are thinking about it, and folks who have started to kind of get into the work and think like, how do we do this thing that we've never done before? And what does it mean exactly? So I'm excited to give you all some of the context and some of the background about what it means to be an HSI. This is a meaning-making kind of conversation. I will give you lots of data, lots of information to think about, lots of references to the research without giving you a definitive answer. And I think that's important to say because people want to know what is an HSI and how do we become one and where's the checklist, right? Without them saying that, often people want the checklist, right? Give me the 10 things I have to do in order to be an HSI, and there's just not a checklist. There's no destination, I would say. There's no point at which we arrive necessarily. It's an ongoing identity process, so we will go through HSI for quite some time. So welcome to the movement, I will say that. I call it an HSI movement. Welcome to the movement, and I'll give you information on what I mean by that on the HSI movement. But I will go ahead and point out first that if you want to access the slides, you can go ahead and use this QR code here. So feel free to pull out your phone so that you can then have access to the slides later. There are a lot of references on the slides, so you might want to refer to them later, or maybe for accessibility reasons, you want to be able to flip through your phone as I'm talking, so feel free to go ahead and use it now. Anytime there is a QR code on the slides, that means the article that I'm talking about is accessible. By article, I mean the journal article. Because as I mentioned, this will be very sort of research-focused presentation with a lot of practical implications of how do we do this? How are we going to do this as we think about our journey to be an HSI? I think I see most folks. All right, still a few more. You got it? Yeah, you got it? All right. Folks are flipping through. All you have to do is push play. You shouldn't have to sign in. I know it's a Prezi. I was a Prezi person early on. I was like an early adopter, and I thought Prezi was gonna take off, and like nobody ever did Prezi. I don't know why. It's really cool. Does anybody do Prezi? Okay, a couple people, but very few people actually do Prezi. So it's cool. It kind of moves in cool ways through the slides. But all of my presentations are on Prezi, so I just continue to use it. So yeah, I want to go ahead and first give y'all a definition of HSI for those of you that don't know what it is. How many of y'all think like you could define HSI? You're like, yeah, I know what that is. Okay, there's a few of these. I always like to point out that people like to do halfways. I think I could, and then a lot of no hands raised, and that's okay, because we're here to think about it. Alternatively, how many of y'all think you know what a HBCU, a historically black college or university is? Okay, I like to see the comparison. A few more hands for sure. I think HBCUs have gotten more sort of narrative in our general conversations. There's been movies that are about HBCUs. There's been TV shows, A Different World. That really dates me back. I was really little when it was out. Some of y'all watched A Different World. It was a good TV show. Beyonce did Homecoming. Remember the Homecoming tour? Yeah, that was like all grounded in HBCU culture. HSIs don't have that sort of mainstream sort of narrative. So people aren't necessarily watching it on TV. We're not seeing performances that represent HSI culture, none of those sort of things. So we're defining, that comes back to the movement, the HSI movement. We're defining currently what it means to be a Hispanic serving institution. And so that's what I mean when I say you're part of the movement. It means you're going to be part of defining what this means. And so for those of you that don't know what it means, don't worry. By the time we're done, I promise you'll have at least some working definition of what this means. HSIs, over here is the definition, 25% Hispanic enrollment. All right, so that is the basic federal definition. You will need to enroll any college or university, nonprofit, by the way. It's only a designation for nonprofit. For-profits cannot get the HSI designation. If you enroll 25% Hispanic students, that means 25% of your population check the box. then you are eligible. There's also an income requirement. So our students are also tend to be high need because that's also part of the definition that our students are Pell eligible. It's 50% typically, but there's a lot of waivers on that because not all campuses meet both. So there tends to be a waiver on the income, but not necessarily the 25%. Like you definitely need the 25%. So that makes you what's called eligible. You're eligible to be an HSI. Eligible means you can then apply for federal grants. These are the federal grants. These are the main ones, Title V, both A and B, and Title III, and then there's also NSF HSI program. USDA has also historically had a program. So it's a federal construct. The federal definition is defined solely by enrollment. And so campuses that become HSIs can stop. That can be it, period. We're an HSI, 25%, 50%, check, check, check. We got a grant, check, we're an HSI. Campuses can do that, and there are many campuses that do that. Usually when someone invites me to a campus, they're not willing to do that. That there's more deeper meaning that people are wanting to get out of HSI. But the reality is the federal government doesn't really require it, doesn't really hold us accountable beyond spending our money the way we're supposed to. So if you get a federal grant, you do have to, you are accountable to the federal government for making sure you spend the dollars the way you've defined in your proposal. But otherwise, not a lot of accountability for most of the things I'm gonna talk about. There are 571 colleges across 30 states. 30 states, including Puerto Rico, so not really a state, but 30 areas in the United States. So this is extensive all the way across the United States. California is home to the most HSIs. What's the last count? Maybe 171 or so of the 571 are California institutions, including all three systems. The California community colleges, 108 of the 116 community colleges are HSIs. So this is an entire system conversation. Many of the campuses I spend time with are actually the community colleges, really trying to think, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do more than this, more than the enrollment? How do we push beyond the enrollment? They represent 19% of all institutions, and 62% of your Latino students enroll in HSIs. There's a correlation between the enrollment and the number of HSIs, obviously, because it's enrollment driven. So we know that the more students that enroll in the HSIs, the more HSIs there's going to be. I think by next year's count, we'll almost be at 600 in the country. We might also be to a couple more states and locations. A majority of states and locations now have at least one or two emerging HSIs. So the diversity of HSIs, I think this is where I stop and pause as a higher education scholar, is to think, why is it so hard to define HSI? Because for most of us trying to figure this out, there's no one definition. It's an ongoing conversation. I call it a co-created conversation. All of us get to decide what it is. But some of the complexities of this is that there is all these different types of HSIs. And so we have the regional diversity, including Puerto Rico. Now, Puerto Rico, obviously there's a language difference even. In Puerto Rico, the dominant language is Spanish. And so even just thinking about different languages, right, and what it means to be an HSI in Puerto Rico versus in California. There's a size difference. There's type 2 years and 4 years. You see there's more 4 years than there are 2 years, but not much. Private versus public, although there's more public institutions, and then all these different missions. And so what I encourage you to think about when you're thinking about your HSI work, because all of you are now part of the movement, you're gonna be thinking, how are we gonna do serving this, is how do we be the best and then fill in the blank here, right? How do we be the best community college in California, in Orange County, right? Like you can narrow it down that much, is how are we going to be the best HSI based on these parameters? Because if you're competing with, let's say, a research institution, let's say UC Irvine, who their core mission is to develop knowledge and research, and that's not your core mission, then that's not really a fair competition because y'all are focused on two different things, right? Similar things in that you want students to come in to be successful, to graduate, but there's a deeper core mission that each institution has. So I call this, how do you be fill in the blank, the best fill in the blank type of HSI? All right, so the good news you're in the running for being the best because there's no best right now. All right, so you're now in the competition for being the best. And that's cool, right? We like to tout what we're really good at. And many of our campuses are really good at a lot of things. So being a good HSI, it can be your new sort of something you want to achieve, right? A new goal for you. The profile of students. So I like to spend time with the profile of students because I like to disrupt the idea of Hispanic only. All right, because Hispanic serving institution sometimes feels weird to people. All right, there's probably at least one person in the room who has thought, well, what does this mean for everybody else? Right, and it's not a bad question to have. It's an important question, and it's a common question. If we're Hispanic serving, does that mean we're no longer serving other students? And that's simply not the case. Hispanic serving institution just means that 25% or more of your students are Hispanic. But it doesn't mean that now all your other students are no longer welcome or that they're no longer enrolling. Even back to the HBCU comparison, HBCUs enroll more than Black students, more than African American students, although it's their largest population and continues to be one of their largest populations on campus. It doesn't mean that they're exclusionary. They don't reject you because you're white. They don't reject you because you're Asian American. They don't reject you for those reasons. Because they're still inclusive, right? They're still inclusive in that way. So HSIs are as well. These are the general profile of HSIs. Every campus is different, obviously. But generally, we're seeing, let's say here, two-year publics, almost 50% of the campus is typically Latino identified on a lot of campuses. This is very common in the California community colleges. A lot of them that I work with are somewhere between 40 and 60, usually hovering between 40 and 60% of the population is Latino identified. So it is an important conversation to have if you're thinking it's one of our largest populations. But we know our Black students are still here, our AAPI students are here, other students of color who are checking various boxes, including mixed, including picking more than one, and then also our white students, right? So this doesn't mean that only serving Hispanic students. So it's an important thing to think about when there's conversations out in the general population about what does it mean to be an HSI? And if anybody who's not here today says, well, we're not only enrolling Hispanics, we don't want to only enroll Hispanics, now you have some information to share back and say, well, that's not the definition, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that we're Hispanic only. We are enrolling a good amount of other students. The other thing to think about is our students are super complex, right? So some of them are checking multiple boxes. So we're not Hispanic only. We might be Hispanic and Asian. We might be Hispanic and white. We might be Hispanic and Black, right? We might be multiple things. And so this can't be an exclusionary concept. It's got to be an inclusionary concept. It's got to be an equity conversation. And it is. It very much aligns with equity. Now, the other thing is the multiple intersections that students have include income. That, like I said, generally low income is one of those that is a higher percentage at HSIs. And then first gen to college tends to be a conversation. These numbers represent the number of low income students. This one looks awkward. It looks extremely high. There's only 9 two-year privates. That's what this one is. So people sometimes wonder, what is that one that has such high percentage of low income students? Two-year privates, not very many of them, but there are 9 in this data set that I got from the national academies. And that is a very high percentage, 77.6% of the students that enroll in two-year privates are low income, right? But otherwise, these are generally the numbers, about 50 or 60%. So we're thinking about race, we're thinking about ethnicity, we're thinking about income, we're thinking about first gen. And then we're thinking about all these other things that could be our students' intersecting identities. They might be US born, they might not. Their parents might not be US born, and they might be. They might be mixed status, they might be undocumented, they might be bilingual, they might be multilingual, they might be bicultural. All of these things could come into play. And therefore the question is, how do we serve this really complex group of students? While also knowing that we're gonna serve all the rest of our students as well. And so the question is a hard one to grapple with. What does it mean to be an HSI becomes really hard for people because of all these complexities of the types of students that are here. And so the answer that I give, the answer to that question, not that it's a final answer, but it really is this idea of servingness. So as I talk through this concept of servingness, it is about serving students by structurally doing something different. How do we structurally change what we're gonna do rather than trying to figure out, well, how are we gonna serve US-born Latinos versus immigrant Latinos versus DACA recipient, right? Like, Rather than that, saying structurally, how do we change so that we're adapting to the students rather than expecting the students to adapt to us? And that's an important concept because higher education, we've historically, all of us are sitting here, means we've probably all been through at least one institution of higher ed that we have historically been expected to adapt to the institution rather than the institution adapting to us. And so the servingness question really says, how do we adapt to the students? How do we stop asking the students to leave all of this at the door? Because we typically tell them to leave all this at the door. Oh, you're bilingual? That's great. Leave it at the door. You're undocumented? Leave that at the door. It doesn't matter. You're a person of color? Leave that at the door. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters in this classroom except that you're going to learn, or on this campus that you're just going to learn, versus bring all that in. I call those the treasures. Bring all the treasures in. Let's bring it in and let's acknowledge that all of these things will actually make for a better educational environment. That's the diversity work from way back when, 1990s, early arguments around diversity in college was actually that diversity made everybody, made the environment better for everybody. And that's the reality, is that all of these different treasures, as I say, or as Tara Yosa says, community cultural wealth that students bring in, is going to benefit all of us. We're all gonna learn, we're all gonna benefit from having students that have all these different treasures that they're bringing into the campus. But servingness, let's talk about servingness. So this is the book, the cover of the book. And this is the citation. So if you wanna be nerdy and read the whole article, feel free. But I'm gonna give you the short version of the article. But I'll show you the model that comes out of the article that we wrote that originally coined this term servingness. That at the time, I didn't really think much about it. It was just servingness. Like, yes, that's the word. At the time, my partner was like, that's not a word, Gina. Servingness. It's serving, right? Like, what is the difference between serving and servingness? And I'm like, it's different. It's an embodiment. And that's what I've come to call it. It's an embodiment. Did I mention I have a podcast yet? No. I just came from IVC. By IVC, I'd already dropped 2 drops. I was telling them that I always drop the podcast or promote the podcast at least 3 times. And the reason I promote the podcast is because we're defining servingness in real time in the podcast. So the reason I bring it up is because in season 3, episode 4, you see Riverside, the title of their episode is Embodying Servingness. And I think their episode just really gets at that. How do you embody this idea of servingness, that from entry to exit, we're always going to serve our students. We're always going to put them first. We're always going to center them and their cultural ways of knowing and their treasures. And that's the embodiment of servingness. And so, yes, the podcast is called ¿Qué pasa HSIs? Feel free to check it out. It's a great thing to listen to on your commute. If you commute, any of y'all commute at least 30 minutes? Yeah? Okay, yeah. So 30 minutes one way, you listen to half the episode, take a break, come to work, and then listen to the other 30 minutes. Those of you that would commute an hour, some of y'all, it's an hour, about an hour episode, huh? So you can get through a whole season in 10 days. In 2 weeks, you'll be all caught up in one season. We have 3 seasons already. We're already working on the 4th. But the idea of servingness and the embodiment of servingness comes through in every single episode. We're talking about what this means in real time. And so I often reference the podcast because I learn often from the podcast. So the definition of servingness, and I don't think this is how we define it in the article. It's probably much more jargony sort of words, but this is how I would say the definition of servingness, enrolling and really I should say enrolling and ... Because enrollment is the beginning. Enrolling 25% Hispanic students is only the beginning of the work. That's it. Now you have a lot more work to do. So it's and everything else you do. Servingness is everything else you're going to do with the students from after the point that they enroll. So we want to educate our students. We're acknowledging their ways of knowing, their lived experiences, their identity. What if that came into our educational systems? And the reality is, it usually doesn't. Like I said, our systems generally ask us to adapt to the system rather than the system adapting to us. And so what if we adapted to the system? What if we adapted to the fact that we know we have Latinx students, Black students, Indigenous students, AAPI students, and that their histories matter, and they're bringing it with them. They're bringing their knowledge, they're bringing their culture to the classroom, into the educational spaces that we provide. So that's that, transforming organizational structures. I'm gonna talk a lot about this. So when I talk about the structures, I want you to think, where are you at on campus? What structure are you responsible for? There's a lot of structures. If you teach in the classroom, that's your structure, right? The classroom is your structure. If you're an advisor and you're a counselor, you're doing advising with students on a daily basis, that's your structure. Structurally, that's where you're thinking about doing servingness. If you're a higher level administrator and you're making policies, making changes on campus to do better servingness work, that's your space, that's your structure for changing. So no matter where you're at, I truly believe that everyone can do servingness work. I think that everybody has some sort of job to make sure that our students are having a really good experience. Providing an environment that leads to academic outcomes, liberatory outcomes, and experiences. I will talk about those more specifically once I get to them. So this is what the model ends up looking like if you download the article. This oval right here, these are what's called the structures for serving. So anytime I say structures, that's what I mean. It really is just the college, right? Everything we do in college. So there's different dimensions of the college. There's plenty of things that don't show up in the article that should be there. So some of y'all might be reading it. Some of y'all are like, I can't see that. I know I can barely see it, and I'm like right next to it. So don't feel bad if you're back there. But some of you are like, I don't see my job up there, so where do I fit? It might not be there only because it wasn't in the literature when we did the review. This was a review of literature. But it doesn't mean you don't belong here. So anything that you do is here, right? This is all part of the structures. And then these are the outcomes. If we do something different than we've always done, or if we adapt to the students, as I've now said, I'm gonna go with that. If we adapt to the students rather than expecting them to adapt to us, we might see different outcomes. And some of the literature I'm gonna show you has actually shown that we are seeing different outcomes. So people are testing this often with Title V and Title III grants, testing whether or not if we change structurally what we're doing, is it going to make a difference in our outcomes for our students? So some of the structures to think about. Mission and value statement, this is a good place to start your conversation. What is our mission? And if y'all are out there and you're like, oh, I'm getting a little tired, let me look at my phone. Look up the mission of the campus. Look up Saddleback College mission and see, what does it say? Does it commit to being an HSI? Does it commit to serving particular groups of students? Is it sort of general? It's a good place to start because this tells us what we're about. It tells us what we're committed to. And this is a really deep conversation that people have. I spent a lot of time with campuses that they're like, well, we don't want to put that we serve a certain population because that feels like we don't serve other populations. So how do we get around that? How do we get around that? How do we create a mission that says we're about equity, we're about justice, we're about serving our students without feeling exclusionary? And so that alone, this could be a committee's work for a whole year. And I've seen it actually happen. Whole year just thinking, what's our mission and what's our values? And how are we gonna incorporate some of these ideas of servingness and what we're doing? The strategic plans is another place, and your DEI plans. This is another place where HSI often comes up, and the concept of servingness is starting to come into play. Your strategic plans is a really good place to put it, because that's your guide. Right? That's what you're deciding to focus on for the next 5 years often. We say these 5 things are gonna be important. So if being an HSI and committing to servingness is important, then we would want it to show up in the strategic plan. We'd want to spend time. We'd want our board of trustees to approve it and say, yeah, that's a good commitment that we have. We really want to do that work. Lay it out for us. Give us some guideposts. Give us some things to measure that we know when we got there, right? That's the indicators for serving. How are we gonna know we got there? How are we gonna know we accomplished that in 5 years? There's measurables. There's measurables here in the servingness framework to help us think, how are we gonna get there, each of us individually? The curriculum, support programs, co-curricular programs, that's all servingness. Servingness happens in all of these structures. Faculty, staff, administration, I'll give you data when we get there. Leadership and decision-making, all the decisions that are happening on campus can be part of servingness. Evaluating, reevaluating what is happening on campus now. How is it harming our students? How is it helping our students? How can we do better, right? Particularly from an equity standpoint. And then our policies and embedded practices. Because oftentimes these are so embedded that we don't necessarily think about them, right? We see the outcome, but we don't really think about these embedded policies of why are there inequities in our transfer rates, right? What's going on at a deeper level? And that's like the million-dollar question, right? Transfer rates, we're all constantly trying to figure out how do we create more equity? How do we do better in that outcome in particular? And there's a lot of deep-seated policies that we need to think about, right? Which is cool because California is constantly coming up with new policies to help us think through, like AB 705, right? Let's think about if all of our students enroll in math and English immediately, is that gonna help, right? And we're seeing good outcomes already. So policy makes such a huge difference on what we decide is important to the campus. And when the state gives us policies, it's even better. Because then the state's saying, hey, you really have to commit to this, to doing this work. So policies are such an important part of the structures. So some of the examples from the book come from different campuses that wrote chapters. And so this one, what I like to point out, this is actually Cal Lutheran University. They, in the book, I learned about them just as we were going through the book process. I didn't know that they went through an active becoming of HSI process, but they did. They were not an HSI and they wanted to become an HSI. And so some of the things they did was they created a strategic plan that included becoming an HSI. It was part of what they wanted to be. They created a task force of people on campus that could help with the work. People that were committed to doing the work, people that were thinking about what it would mean to have an HSI identity. They started recruiting and thinking about retention of faculty of color, specifically around the policies for doing this. It was an active sort of process. In particular, they talk about how they enrolled in one of USC's Center for Race and Equity. I think it was the Center for Urban Ed, actually, at the time, the Center for Urban Ed at the time, before it changed to its new name. They have a series of workshops on how to think about faculty diversity. And so they were engaged in that. They were involved with external organizations like the Alliance of HSI Educators, which I highly recommend. This is a place where practitioners who are doing HSI work on a daily basis come together and share the best practices that they're finding that are working on campus. And so they got really, really involved with all these different things. And their outcome was they had 3 HSI grants in 2 years because they were so focused on it as a campus. And so there was good stuff going on, and then it started moving. They started helping them to sort of move their work. The faculty profile. This one's an important slide. So the general takeaway from this slide is that our faculty diversity does not match our student diversity. That's what I want you to think about, is that our student diversity is often much more diverse. If I juxtapose this with the original slide of the student diversity, and even if we pulled up your data, your student demographic data and your faculty demographic data, we're likely to see some discrepancies. All right, now these are general data. This is 118 campuses that had Title V grants. So 118 campuses that had Title V grants. The researchers, this is Nicholas Vargas who did this, led this research project. They found that no matter how they looked at the data, the yellow, which is white faculty, the yellow was still the largest population. So that says there is a mismatch between your student population, that's the white students is decreasing, not because we don't like white students or not because we don't want to serve them, but just that's the general enrollment patterns that we're seeing. So it's decreasing while our students of color are increasing, particularly our Hispanic, Latinx students. Yet this number is not changing. There's a couple things with this. One, white faculty, if you're a white faculty member, you got to do this work. All right, so this doesn't say we don't want you here. It actually says, we want you here, but we want you to think about HSI even more, right? Because the reality is, what the research tells us is that diverse faculty are more likely to mentor and engage with students of color. And so that's what we're looking for. We're looking for folks who are willing to mentor and engage with students of color. It's also, the research also says that they're more likely to use culturally relevant pedagogies. So in the classroom, more likely to be culturally relevant. And also that students of color want to see faculty that look like them standing up in front of them. Or maybe not standing, it might be in Zoom, right? Just see faculty that look like them. So the diversity matters. The other thing about the ratios that I think was really important in this article was that they found that a white faculty member at an HSI, at these 118 HSIs, the ratio of white faculty to white students at these campuses was 1 to 10. It's a little bit. 1 faculty, 10 students for every 1 faculty that looked like them, right? Had similar sort of racial identities as them. Whereas Latinx faculty, which are much smaller, right? That's the red numbers here, much smaller, but Latinx students are much higher at HSIs, the ratio is 1 to 146. So this is huge. The way to think about this is that a faculty member of one has a lot more students to serve if those students are looking for someone that looks like them. And they often are, right? That's just natural sort of human nature, that feels good to see faculty that look like us and have faculty that are teaching in ways that feel like they are meaningful to us and that sometimes allow us to bring our treasures into the classroom. And that's often what happens with faculty of color. So this was a really important article to think about. And this is generally across the board. I've yet to meet an HSI where their faculty diversity aligns with their student diversity. It just isn't happening. That's okay. There's a lot of reasons why. Mostly we know that faculty stay in their jobs a long time, right? So it takes a little bit longer for the turnover versus our students turnover every, 2, 3, 4 years. So they stay in the jobs a long time. Now, what we have to do is think more strategically about when we do have openings, right? When we have an opening, how are we going to flip this? How are we going to start to think more intentionally about the faculty diversity, knowing like, hey, remember that keynote where Dr. Garcia came in like 6 months ago and she was talking about faculty diversity, and now we have these faculty lines? That's a good time to bring this conversation back in, right? Because maybe it's not the conversation at the moment, but it will be in 5 months, 6 months, because these things are cyclical. We know that. So when we have the opportunity to hire new faculty, are we thinking about how we're going to make them look more like our students? There's lots of ways to do that. I usually get at least one question about it, so I'll give y'all time to ask me that question about what does that look like? How do we change faculty diversity? The other thing about the faculty diversity is the pathways into faculty positions. So this slide, I always debate if I'm going to talk about graduate enrollment at a community college or at a campus that doesn't have graduate programs. But I actually talked about this at IVC at the conversation earlier, and there were several comments, questions, conversations about this exact point. So I think it is an important conversation about thinking, what are the pathways into faculty? And typically it's graduate programs. Right? Typically, you need at least a graduate degree in order to be faculty at a community college. And so what we found was that over a 10-year period, the number of Latinx identified graduate students, which is this, barely went up. It went up. It went from here to there. It was slow sort of progression, whereas the undergraduate population went up tremendously. So this was by 2015. If we did this again, I'm sure it'd be like up here now, right? Because it's still continuing to increase. So it'd be about here, but this one isn't moving as quickly. So this era represents the statistically significant difference. So the of you that are stats nerds, any stat nerds? Stats nerds, this was actually statistically significantly different. The number of undergraduate identified Latina students at an HSI was different than Latina identified graduate students. So we're not even seeing our students of color entering graduate programs. So how do we start to change that, right? How do you start to change that in your role? How do we start to help students to see themselves on a pathway to graduate school? We talk about pathways a lot in the community colleges. How does graduate school become one of the multiple options of pathways for our students? Because we know graduate school isn't for everybody, but graduate school is good for some. They just need to know about it. Thinking about the idea of first-generation college students, that they don't necessarily know even what graduate school is. I know I didn't know what a graduate degree was when I was a bachelor's. When I was enrolled, I was at Cal State University Northridge. I had no idea that my degree was even called a bachelor's degree. I was like, I don't know what that is. I'm just getting a degree, right? And some of our students, many of our students, maybe some of y'all probably feel the same way. As a first generation to college student, we're like, I don't know, I'm getting a degree. I don't know what a bachelor's degree is. I don't know the difference between a BS and a BA. I definitely don't know what a master's, MA-MS is. Definitely don't know what a PhD is. So how do we start to build knowledge around graduate going culture if our students we know might not have that, right? Creating more knowledge for them. So if that is one of their desired pathways, we can at least open it up for them, right? Start to give them some more ways to think about that pathway. So that one ended up being a really important. The citations here, if you want to read it, me and my grad student, we did that, and we just found this really important finding that we really weren't expecting, actually. We didn't know it was going to be that dramatic of a difference. Another place that we spend time structurally changing what we do is the curriculum, right? So how many of y'all are working on your syllabus today, tomorrow, the next couple of days. Me too, y'all. I'm right there with y'all. I was working out yesterday. I'm working again tomorrow. You know, I took a little break to come spend time with y'all today. But the curriculum is an important place where servingness happens. So remember what I said, everybody has a job, everybody has a role in servingness and HSIs. Your role, if you are in the classroom setting teaching students, is the curriculum. Thinking about how are we going to change the curriculum to adapt to the students instead of expecting the students to adapt to us. Expecting that they should excel and succeed based on our pretty normative, usually normative definitions of success. I know by normative definitions of success, I mean that we continue to often do the same thing over and over again and expect different results, right? We're going to use the three-test model, same three-test model over and over again, yet we continue to see inequities. Why? Because maybe that's not the best model for our students. How do we adapt to them? How do we use 2 tests and 1 writing prompt instead? Or 2 tests and 1 autobiography instead, right? How do we do something different that allows our students to tap into their ways of knowing? So this example comes from UC Santa Cruz, and this was their math curriculum transformation. They had a Title V grant, and they were focused on STEM. They were trying to change the outcomes in STEM. They were looking at STEM. They saw students entering STEM programs, but not actually finishing STEM programs. That's a pretty common narrative. We're often trying to address STEM. And so they were seeing that, and what they found as they dug into their data, they were digging into the disaggregation of data, and they found that their entry-level algebra class was a place that students were struggling and or not getting out of, not succeeding in, and therefore changing their major, right? So that one course was the reason why students were changing their major. Students who wanted to be STEM majors, students who were capable of being STEM majors, were no longer being STEM majors because of that course. The course was discouraging them. Do any of y'all teach algebra? Oh, because the AB 570. Wait, what is it? 705? Yeah. All right. So see, the policy already changed it. But the entry-level math course that you are teaching, right? Whatever that is. The entry-level math course, imagine that that's the course that students are entering, because that's what theirs was. There was that entry-level algebra course. That entry-level math course, imagine that it's your course that is the reason why students are changing their major. Now, back to this idea of adapting to the students. You can either see that and see those data and turn your head and say, they're not prepared. They didn't take, AP math in high school. They went to a high school that didn't prepare them. Their parents aren't educated. Their parents don't care about college. Their parents this. They work too much. I'm coming up with all these excuses we tend to put on students. Instead of saying, well, maybe the course needs a little bit of adjustment. Maybe I should do something different. Maybe I should adapt so the students can succeed. Particularly, and getting back to the policy, actually, my colleagues and I, we wrote a report about the community colleges in California being HSIs, and we dug into some of the policies, reports that have been written so far, the policy briefs about that policy. And what we're seeing is that students are entering that math and English class, right, college level math and English class, but they still aren't necessarily succeeding in the course. And the conversation in those practice briefs and those policy briefs is like, because the course hasn't been changed, right? So just because we put students into it doesn't mean that they get out of it. That's some of the narrative that's come out. There are practice briefs that have been published by the USC's Center for Race and Equity that show that people are saying, yes, we're seeing changes. People are entering entry-level math and entry-level algebra, or college-ready, right? College-level algebra and college-level English immediately, but not always getting out. And it's this conversation of, do we need to change the curriculum? And that's what they were doing here at UC Santa Cruz, is they said, all right, we're gonna change the course. We're gonna do it differently, and we're going to do it differently, and we're gonna track whether or not it makes a difference, whether or not more students successfully get out of math. And so that's what they did. And they did find there was an increase in academic confidence of the students, and also higher course grades. So students were getting higher course grades after they went through this whole transformation of the curriculum. So they worked really hard. It wasn't easy. The math department was not happy about it. I'll tell you that. They were not happy about it, so much so that the professor that did the change was sort of ousted from the department because she was like, I'll do it, I'll change it. And the math department wasn't really having it. But they did see some great outcomes. So that's an adaptation of something that's not working for our students so that it can better work for our students, right? And in y'all case, yeah, there's a policy that's saying we need to get students into the college level ready math. Cool. Now the college ready math course needs to be ready for them, right? We need to make sure that they're ready, that it's ready for them. And that's what this chapter talked about. This structure, originally, we had done this open call for articles that were about intersectionality. So me and my colleague, Marcela Cuellar, we wanted to hear from people that were doing work around intersectionality. How do we serve students that are in the H, Hispanic, but also other things, right? And so this one, I was like surprised that it came through internships. I was like, internships? I didn't really thought about internships as servingness until I read the article. And then I was like, oh yes, absolutely internships. So the internships, the way they talk about it is that the internships in the research shows that internships work. That students who get internships, actually, it's a high impact practice. The data show that high impact practices are pretty good at helping students, retaining them and also graduating them. So internships is one of them, undergraduate research is one of them. What else? Learning communities is one of those high impact practices. There's a series of 12 now, I believe, high impact practices that have been shown in research to be really good. And some of y'all might be doing some of those, right? Because they tend to be conversations we have of like, this works. Let's do it. Let's do some high impact practices. Now, what they questioned is who has access to the high impact practice? So just because you say internships are good, students, doesn't mean that they're going to have access to it. For example, they talked about art students, right? Students who are art students that were like, okay, so I have to have an internship, but there's no internships in art, right? There's a disconnect on what we're offering versus what we're telling to the students. So this is a structure, right? This is the structure for surveying. If we're gonna ask students to do something that we know is good for them, then we wanna make sure that it's available for them, right? That's changing the structure. That's making sure that's available. And then also, another important thing that often gets overlooked is asking students. And so in this, students were polled, they were asked through a survey why they didn't participate in internships. And one of them was the course load was too heavy, right? Makes sense, like, okay, yeah, if your course load is too heavy, you can't add on an internship. But then we're saying you should have an internship, right? So how do we address that? That sounds like a policy we could think through, right? About like maybe this semester we ask students to have an internship, it counts as a course. I don't know, right? Or maybe that semester we don't put them in as many courses, right? We lighten up the course load. Lack of opportunities, are we making them available to students? They need to work to get paid, right? We all want to work to get paid. Who wants to work for free? And that's the reality is internships have historically been, hey, if you intern for free, you'll learn this thing, it's good for you. Doesn't mean you're getting paid. So a lot of students are gonna say, I'm not doing it, right? A lot of us are gonna say, I'm not doing it. I don't wanna do unpaid work, right? So they're not paid or insufficiently paid, or this one was interesting, lack of transportation. So let's say the internship is like an hour away, but they're like, I don't have a car, and there's no bus line that goes that way. So how am I gonna get there? Right? So thinking, how are we going to support students? That's a lot of structural issues that we need to help our students. So this one ended up being really interesting, I thought. When originally I didn't really know what I was going to think of this idea of internships being a part of servingness. But this one helps me with my claims that everything we do is servingness. Because it is. It really is. And then starting to look at disaggregating who's accessing these opportunities. Advising, this one is really important also. So our students go through advising, right? They often spend time with a counselor so that they know what courses to take, and the counselors help them. And the counselors are supposed to be caring and supportive. Yet at UC Santa Cruz, when they asked students about their experiences on campus, students said that they were experiencing microaggressions in the advising sessions. That's powerful, right? That's like, okay. What does this look like? How do we know what it is? How do we not do it? And that's what they took up with this multicultural advising conference, is they decided they would have a conference similar to this and said, we're all gonna come together and we're going to talk about what a microaggression looks like in an advising session. We're gonna talk about how not to do it. And they did it through a theater of the oppressed approach where they had people performing what that looks like. And they had people being able to intervene on what it should look like when a microaggression in advising is happening. So this is important, particularly when it comes to microaggressions. Oftentimes we don't realize we're doing microaggressions. That's the hard part, right? And that many of us do them. Even minoritized groups microaggress other folks, right? We do it all the time because it's sort of ingrained in our US society. And so being able to identify the microaggression is important. And so that's what they did. They spent the day, and they did this twice. They had a Title V grant, so 2 times they ran this multicultural advising conference, and they found that people were learning a lot. They surveyed them. UC Santa Cruz was really good with their Title V grants. They collected a lot of data. So they had a lot of evidence that the stuff they were doing was actually working. They found that one person said that being affirming even with small accomplishments to help build self-confidence, that was what they learned, right? Like just it was small, micro affirmations is what it's called in the literature. Just micro affirming people makes a huge difference to that student who might have come in thinking that you were gonna help them, and then all of a sudden they feel microaggressed, right? Like, why did they say that to me? Was it a microaggression? Did I imagine that? And that's the reality of microaggressions. We don't always even know that they're happening, or we have to second guess ourselves. So those are the structures. If you didn't see yourself in the structures, don't worry. Even if you ask me a question like, I do such and such on campus, I can think of a way for you to be serving this. Like if you're like, I'm in food services. I'm like, all right, well, what kind of food do you offer on campus? What times of the day do you offer it? Where is it offered? Is it accessible to students? What about the night students? What about, students early in the morning, right? There's always a question that can be asked as far as, are we adequately serving our students and meeting their needs? But then the indicators of serving is also important. It's like, how are we going to measure? Once we change, like I said, UC Santa Cruz was really good about their data, and they looked at different measures, right? They looked at different measures of like whether or not their indicators were helping. So the first round of indicators, there's 3 different types of indicators that we talk about in the research. One is academic outcomes. These tend to be the most common outcomes that we talk about on college campuses. These are things we talk about all the time. So access and affordability, this is really important. We want students to be able to access higher ed, and we want it to be affordable, right? This is an important indicator of us serving minoritized populations, right? So HSIs that can say we are accessible and we are affordable is really, it's an indicator of servingness, right? Check, all right, we do that. Semester to semester persistence. I'll show you an example from the book about one person who looked at semester to semester persistence and how it mattered that you looking at one semester to the next could make a big difference. GPA and course grades, completion of certificates, graduate and completion, successful transfer to 4 years. This is important. I always think about transfer being a community college function, and then I talk to 4 years and they say transfer is one of their outcomes as well, which is really important because we need to think about transfer sending and transfer receiving, right? And the places where y'all are sending students out, are they ready, right? Do we want to send students to places that they're not ready, right? So there's a transfer sending and a transfer receiving. The 4 years can be saying, we're looking at transfer. We want to make sure we are getting more transfer students. We want to make sure we're ready. That's surveying us. Post-baccalaureate enrollment, job and career outcomes. Obviously, we want our students to get jobs. We want them to graduate and get a degree, or transfer and graduate and get a degree, and we want them to get jobs. Those are important. Those are indicators of serving. It's indicators that we're doing our job. So indicator that we're doing something that matters. And then social mobility, right? Students that are coming here because they want to move up in society and they want to move up their families. That's an important concept as an HSI to think about. Students of color, Latino students often bring their families with them, right? Minoritized populations often say, this isn't for me, this is for us, right? It's for the whole family. We're all going to become socially mobile. That's called community uplift. How does community uplift become a part of your servingness? It can. It absolutely can. It doesn't have to be only an individual outcome. So this one came from the book. This one's a 2-year college. The author, she actually got a grant to look at advising practices. There's a lot of examples of advising, which is important, right, for our students to get advising. And she looked at if they got intrusive advising. That's the kind of advising where the advisor is like actively reaching out to the students, texting them, calling them, emailing them, going to find them in their class. I mean, that level of intrusiveness, right? That exists on some campuses. So she looked if that mattered. And what she found was that there were a greater proportion of students in the treatment group, which was those that got the intrusive advising, who enrolled by October. This was semester to semester persistence. So if your students in October are already enrolled for the spring, that's a good outcome, right? Whereas students that weren't were less likely to be enrolled already by October. They weren't likely to have been enrolled, which means they might not enroll in the spring. This is an important outcome, right? When we're looking at enrollment on a semester to semester basis. This is serving us. We can look at it like this. The non-academic outcomes or the liberatory outcomes. Originally in the model, we call it non-academic, but the reality is a lot of this happens in academic spaces. So those of you that are teaching in the academic space on campus, these can be your outcomes as well. These are important outcomes. Critical consciousness is like my favorite HSI liberatory outcome. And by liberatory, I mean that education is liberating for people. That when they come here and they leave, they feel like this was a space where they could be who they are, where they could learn about themselves, they could learn about their histories, and where they feel like they were valued and that they can go out and change the world. Liberatory education versus coming here and saying, just pour knowledge into my head, I'm gonna take it and I'm not gonna think about it much, I'm just here to get the degree, versus no, we're gonna see you as who you are. We're gonna help you to grow and become a critical contributor to society. Critical consciousness. This one often comes out of ethnic studies, which is why the ethnic studies movement in the community colleges is so important. But critical consciousness should come out of everywhere if it was really an outcome we cared about. For example, math. I'm always gonna go back to math. One of my colleagues is a scholar of social justice mathematics. Social justice mathematics is very common in the K through 12 system. There's scholars who are studying what does it look like to teach mathematics through a social justice lens, meaning that we're teaching our students about the core mathematic concepts while also teaching them about the world, about society, about why their neighborhood that they live on has a liquor store on every other corner, but the neighborhood here where they go to school doesn't have any of those. Why? Why does that look like that? How does that become a mathematical concept? What's the distance between my house and the liquor store versus my house and access to health care, right? Like those sort of things, social justice issues through a mathematical lens. And so critical consciousness, ethnic identity development, well-being, mental health can come through in every class. That's the goal. That's how I think about liberatory education, is like your classroom can be a space where liberation happens. That's the ethnic studies concept. So how do we teach ethnic studies across the curriculum? My colleague who teaches social justice mathematics, she teaches it for future teachers, K through 12 teachers, and she has 8 different segments that in the course, in one of the courses she teaches, and ethnic studies is one of them. So it's a core dimension of teaching, although they're learning to be good math educators, right? That's the core reason why they're there, to be good math educators, to teach core math concepts. So this can happen anywhere. You know where I think about critical consciousness? Engineering, right? Nursing, right? Lawyers, law school, future lawyers. These are all great places where we can teach critical consciousness. It doesn't have to just be in ethnic studies. It can be across the curriculum. It can be in the spaces where our students want to go out and do good work. It could be in finance class. I have a colleague who is a financial consultant, and she does it bilingually with the Spanish-speaking community. And it brings her great joy to teach financial literacy to her community, right, in their language. And believe me, it's really hard, because financial Spanish is not the same Spanish she learned. There's that, right, about language and linguistic servingness. Are we teaching our students to use their multilingual skills to serve their communities? She's had to learn herself, right? But that's critical consciousness, right? If our finance class is teaching, how are we gonna serve our communities with these financial concepts? That's the critical consciousness. So these liberatory outcomes can be just about anything across any part of our curriculum. It can also be in our co-curricular experiences. I think I'm coming up on time, so I'm gonna skip that one. I do wanna talk about validating experiences, but through this lens of intersectionality. So intersectionality, or validating experiences, is something we've known for a long time in higher ed research, that students want to be validated in the classroom. They wanna feel like they belong, they wanna feel like they're smart, they wanna feel like you see them, they wanna feel like you value them, all of those validating experiences. They wanna know that you value them for who they are as a person. But what starts to happen when we start to get an intersectionality, so for example, LGBTQIA students who are Latina identified might say, you know, my HSI, it was a good environment, but some spaces were anti-gay, even though they were pro-Latino. And so I had to partition myself, right? Over here, I could be a queer Latino. Over here, I could only be Latino. That's hard for people who want to be full holistic selves, right? Allowing people to be their full selves matters. So that's what this article, lots of words. I told you there's lots of words in the slides. So when you access the slides, tons of words in the slides. But that's what really comes out of this is like some spaces on campus were isolating and alienating because of my multiple identities. Affirming environments and individuals, yes, that happens, but not across the whole campus. How do we make sure that the whole campus feels inviting and welcoming and inclusive of people at their intersections? The other one I would say is making sure that we're talking about racialized experiences. So racism lives here. I'm going to say that again. Racism lives here. It lives everywhere in the United States because we are, the principles that we're founded on as a country allow racism to live on, right? And to live on not necessarily amongst the people, but within the structures even, right? It's within the people as well, but structurally, racism, microaggressions happen because structurally we're still, it's still embedded in our systems. And so to think that because we have a really diverse population of students, now racism is no longer happening, that's a false hope because it is still happening. Oppression is still happening to multiple groups, even though we have diversity. Even though women are usually the largest enrolled group. There's more women, typically, women-identified people than men-identified people or trans and non-binary people on a college campus. They still don't hold the power in the campus. There's still patriarchy that comes and creeps through. They're still experiencing sexism because it's a larger system. And so these experiences have got to be part of our conversation. There's a ton of articles here. Feel free to download the QR codes, but basically all these articles say the same thing. People are continuing to report uncomfortable experiences at HSIs. And some of the more recent research is starting to come through across faculty and staff. That faculty and staff are saying, I don't feel like I belong here. I experience racism here. And I don't want to experience racism. I don't want to experience microaggressions. How do we disrupt this? And so this has got to be a part of our general conversations. The final piece of this, the only thing I will point out here is some of the HSI work that was done. When is this written? This was written in 2018. 2009 to 2016. So Nick Vargas, who had written that article about the faculty diversity, in that same data set, they looked at Title V grants, the abstracts, and what they found that there was a lot of race-neutral work going on in HSI. And in particular in these grants, that people were using race-neutral language. By race-neutral, I mean they were not naming Latino students. For HSI grants, they were not naming Latino students. They were saying, with our HSI grant, we're gonna serve low-income and first-generation students. Something to that effect, not necessarily those two. Not naming that they wanted to serve Latino students with an HSI grant. And so that's important because it did not center and or use race-neutral language. 85% of the ones that they reviewed from 2009 to 2016 used race-neutral language or didn't center Latino students. And I wanna sort of wrap up with this to think about HSI work as being a really interesting space of like, how do we center our Latino students without excluding other students? How do we center equity work without excluding anybody, right? That's the ongoing conversation. And I think the answer is equity, because when we're doing equity work, we're going to focus on the populations that need it the most. Your Hispanic students tend to have greater inequities. Not always, but a lot of times they do. In the classroom outcomes, in the transfer rates, in the number of students who are getting certificates, all of those data tend to show that your Hispanic students have greater inequities in the outcomes. So should we center them? Absolutely. That's a good reason to think about if we're thinking about our equity work and focusing on the students that really have the highest need on our campus. But part of that takes us assessing where is the highest need and how can we do that as part of our HSI work. Only other thing I will say is this, is that the model isn't complete. There's plenty of things we didn't talk about. So if you feel like you weren't in this model, I can probably come up with a way that you probably are, because I really do think that all of us can do the servingness work. Final plug, Here's the download, the QR code for the podcast. So if you want to listen to Que Pasa HSIs, there's some great conversations that are going on in Que Pasa HSIs. We're talking about this idea of linguistic serviness. We're talking about this idea of math. There's actually, for the math fans over here, this is the same row over here, that's talking about math. Season 3, episode 2, we talk about disrupting cis heteronormative patriarchy in the math classroom. That's a mouthful right there, right? I think people clicked on it just because of the title. I would have clicked on that, like, what the heck is cis heteropatriarchy in the math classroom? But we dig into the math classroom, right? How do we start to disrupt racism, cis heteronormativity in the classroom? So the Que Pasa HSIs podcast really is just that, real-time thinking about how we can do some of this on a daily basis. So thank you all for engaging with me this afternoon. Appreciate you.
We have just a few minutes. If anyone has any burning questions, we will take one or two. We want to be respectful of Dr. Garcia, who needs to catch a plane, but I'm guessing we may have a question or two. Anybody? Not a soul has a question? Of course I have one, but I'd rather hear one from one of you. All right, I'll ask one. What do you think of programs that contextualize curriculum for particular cultural groups? So Puente, for instance. What do you think of that as a model for how we might do some of our work and establish greater servingness through curriculum?
I love that question. I think it's a great approach. So I actually did a presentation at another community college here in California, and there was a Puente instructor in the classroom, and she raised her hand, or in the workshop that I was giving, she raised her hand, she said, you know what? I was trained by Puente for a week, right? She said, I went through a week-long training of how to teach in the Puente program, how to teach Puente students. And she said, and what I learned there, I can't not do with the rest of my students. So she said, I teach my Puente class like a Puente class, but I teach my non-Puente class like a Puente class. Right, and I see some head nods, and it's probably from Puente folks who have been through the training, that know that what we know works for a population, which Puente is a proven outcomes, right, of working for a population, that it works for other populations as well, right? So I think that's a great question, and any sort of good practices you have on campus, I think that's a way to think about it. How do we elevate it? How do we learn? Because anybody that learns a good way to engage community college students of color, minoritized population in a classroom, is not going to only isolate it to that one space. It's just not good pedagogy, right? We're going to transfer it to the other spaces. So I think it's a great way to think about servingness work.
So learning from Puente and trying to scale it, trying to figure out what those learnings are, which is, for those of you who don't know, we're about to do a Puente pilot, and that's exactly what we hope to do, is to be able to take learnings from that and scale it, make it bigger than one cohort of 35 students. Any other last questions? Karima, yell it out, and then I'll repeat it in my microphone. I was thinking about that too. Why is the percentage of Latinx students in private 2-year and 4-year students greater than in public? So the underlying question is there greater affinity or other predatory practices?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer that's documented by the research, but what I will say from some of the private colleges that I've worked with is that private colleges, once they convince, I won't say predatory, but once they do a lot of outreach and convince students that they're going to cover a majority of that tuition, it starts to become more appealing, right? That's the reality, is private institutions can help cover a lot of tuition, particularly for low-income students. Right, so some of your Latinx low-income students, first-gen students, might be going to a private college for almost $0, right? Even less than maybe the community colleges. So that would be my guess. But we know there's a lot of students in the public systems as well, both 2-year and 4-year.
They may actually be better at lowering barriers than we are.
They might, yeah. And private institutions are often smaller. So I work with some private institutions, and they can create that sense of belonging. They can really wrap themselves around students, right? It's a different feel to be at a small private versus a large 2-year public, right? So there could be a number of reasons, but it is what it is. We see the higher numbers. Now I will say, that same article that showed the faculty diversity, they found that at private institutions, there was even greater disparities. So greater number of Latino students and greater number of non-diverse faculty.
Hi, thank you. Really interesting presentation. Really appreciate it. We spent a lot of time here talking about at this college a variety of different metrics that we use to try to measure student success, KPIs, and student learning outcomes, and this, that, and the other. And I'm often concerned that we're focusing so much on the metrics that we're failing to ask how those metrics are being produced. And I think it matters fundamentally how and why we're getting the outcomes we're getting. So I want to make sure, I want to ask them, how do we make sure that we're getting the outcomes we want because students are learning and because students are having their experiences validated, because they're feeling welcome and valued, as opposed to the kind of pressure that can come when there's so much focus on outcomes. People will respond by maybe achieving those outcomes however they can.
Yes.
Maybe in ways that are not so great.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. That's exactly where my whole idea of liberatory outcomes came from, which is exactly what you're talking about, right? It sounds like you may have come from like a high stakes environment too, right? Like K through 12, high stakes environment, that's what happens, right? Not necessarily, but we know that, right? We've heard of the high stakes testing environment that particularly in K through 12 schools, when there's so much focus on the high stakes test that you lose all the other stuff. You lose the racial identity development. You lose the linguistic practices. You lose the engaging pedagogy because you're so focused on the outcome, right? And that's the concern with the high stakes testing, right? That's been the concern with the high stakes testing, and why there's been a lowering of it in recent times. But that's exactly what I am arguing with the liberatory outcomes. Is like, yes, graduation is important. Graduation's always going to be important from a policy perspective, from a federal perspective, from our parents' perspective, right? Your parents, all they care about is that their student is going to finish, right? Are they going to finish and are they going to get a job? Is Mija going to get a job? Cool, she can come, right? She can go to your school. If not, what's the point, right? Why am I sending her here? Right, or him, or them, right? Like, why am I sending them here? So that's always going to be an important outcome. But what are we doing that's more? Right? Particularly in an environment in higher ed where we see people are not coming to college. What is value added? Right? That's all that liberatory sort of education. When I say liberatory education, for those of you that are Paulo Freire fans, it's from a Paulo Freirean perspective, right? That education can be more than just, and he uses the banking system concept, which is the pouring of knowledge into people's head without thinking much more about them or what they contribute to the classroom. That's a liberatory education, is that we value people and what they contribute as well. So yes, you're spot on. You got the message I was sending. You got it.
And with that, can I ask for one more round of applause for Dr. Garcia?
Thank you.
Bye, Sonny.
Okay.
Thank you for being here. Without further ado, let me call to the podium Academic Senate President Dr. Margot Lovett.
If anybody needs to stand up and stretch, please go ahead and do that. I know that can sometimes get the blood flowing. So welcome, everybody. Before I get started, I need to acknowledge and thank the Academic Senate officers for all of their hard work this year. They are President-elect Heidi Ochoa, past President Dan Walsh, Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, Efren Rangel, Vice President at Large, Femia Scarfone, and Recorder Michelle Duffy. Now, most of you already know this, but the Academic Senate meets the first and third Wednesdays of the month from 2 to 4 in the AGB conference room. We are public meetings. We are open to everyone, so please come on by and join us. The comments that I'm going to make are going to take about 10 to 15 minutes, so I will not keep you here for very long. But what I do want to start by saying is I want to give a plug to what we're calling our Spotlight series of presentations. This was initiated by Heidi Ochoa, and to date we have done 2 series of focused professional development activities during Flex Week. The first was during spring 2023, and that centered on disabled students. The second, which was held in fall, highlighted Latinx experiences, and this week's sessions comprise the 3rd series, and they focus on LGBTQIA+ issues. We started this morning with our keynote speech by Lance Lockwood, who is a communications studies professor at Santa Ana College. And I'd like to mention some of the statistics that he shared with us because they are directly related to what I'd like to talk with you about now. A nationwide survey of LGBT students found that 70% reported being bullied at school because of their sexual orientation. Only 27% of queer youth felt that they could definitely be themselves at school, and only 25% said that they always felt safe in class. The data that we've collected for Saddleback's LGBTQIA+ students show no significant equity gaps for their course success rates, and that is definitely something we can celebrate. But there are other statistics that are far less celebratory. 50% of LGBTQ students at Saddleback said that they had been harassed or made to feel unwelcome at school by faculty. 65% said that they were harassed by other students. Some queer students reported being afraid to come out to classmates because they feared they would be seen as a bad person. I find these startling and profoundly depressing statistics. They help explain why gay students feel isolated and that they don't belong at school. And queer Saddleback students who don't feel fully welcomed or included on our campus succeed in their classes despite these feelings of alienation. So all of this made me start to seriously think about inclusion and what it means to be truly included. Now, over the past several years, all of us in academia have been increasingly aware of the importance of creating educational environments that are diverse, equitable, inclusive, accessible, and anti-racist. That's the new acronym. Now, I can be kind of cynical, but I choose not to, because I see this as a profoundly humanistic venture, because the goal is to create spaces where all students can thrive and be valued. While diversity is something that has been discussed for decades, as Dr. Garcia noted, and equity has been the primary focus of our efforts currently, the meaning of the 3rd element of the original DEI acronym, inclusion, has often not received the same in-depth consideration as the first 2. So what I'd like to discuss with you all today is what happens when we move past inclusion as a buzzword and really and honestly think in depth about what it means. Now, maybe a good place to start is to think about what inclusion is not, right? Inclusion is not grudgingly accepting or tolerating others. It isn't saying that everyone is welcome, but really meaning, well, only if they dress a certain way, act a certain way, or conform to normal, in quotes, behavior. So what is inclusion? Well, at its heart, I think inclusion means genuine belonging, which in turn means being seen and valued for who you really are. Inclusion and belonging mean being able to be yourself without fear that you will be judged, emotionally or psychologically bullied or harmed, or at its worst, be the target of hate and violence. Not feeling included makes you censor yourself. You change aspects of who you are to fit in and to be safe. And this is one of the first lessons that some of us who fear not being accepted learn. We learn to hide the parts of our identities that others may not accept or may use against us. Believing that you need to censor yourself to be accepted is a symptom of exclusion, right? It is the polar opposite of inclusion. Part of what it means to be excluded is to be judged and found lacking, not because of something you've done, but simply because of who you are. Being excluded means that you constantly have to be on guard. But when you're in an environment where you are truly included and know that you can simply be who you are, it's like letting out the breath you weren't even aware you were holding. Quite literally, it is like being able to breathe again. And honestly, looking back, I realized that without being aware of it, I held my breath a lot at various points in my life. And I'd like to give you an example of a couple of those times. When I was a senior in college, I spent 14 months in Kenya, a country in East Africa, doing study abroad. The program combined classroom instruction with experiential learning, so each student carried out a project in their area of academic interest. Now, at the time, I was interested in community development, and it turned out that there was an American-led organization called the Institute of Cultural Affairs that was coordinating a comprehensive community development project near the school. And they agreed to let me volunteer in their adult literacy program. So I commuted every day from my dorm in Nairobi out to the project in Kawangware. I was the only commuter since the permanent staff, which consisted of about 20 Americans and Kenyans, some of whom were couples with children, lived together on site. After I'd been working there for about a month, the woman who headed the education program was transferred to another one of ICA's development projects. The project leader asked me if I would take over her job until her replacement arrived, and I agreed at the age of 21. Since I was now officially on staff, I happily moved out to Kawangware and into the project, where I shared a room with 2 other young, unmarried female staff members. The first morning after I had moved in, I was awakened at 5:30 by a knock on our door, and a voice called out, "Praise the Lord, Christ has risen." One of my roommates responded, "He has risen indeed." This was how I learned that the ICA was the operational branch of a Chicago-based Christian organization called the Ecumenical Institute, and that this was our summons to attend morning prayers. Now, what you need to know in order to appreciate my reaction to all of this is that I am Jewish. My family wasn't particularly religious, but my sister and I had attended Hebrew school, which is kind of like Sunday school. And at 13, both of us had bat mitzvahs, which is the coming of age ceremony. By this point in my life, I only occasionally attended temple with my father on the major Jewish holidays. But the fact that I was a lapsed Jew didn't mean that I was ready to embrace Christianity. I should tell you that I had, and to be honest, all these years later, still have a tremendous amount of respect for my ICA colleagues who quietly and genuinely lived their spiritual beliefs and chose to put their religious values of living among and working with the least fortunate among us into action. But I also learned that they were not interested in really getting to know or to understand me. Even though I told them that first morning that I was Jewish, they still expected me to fully participate in the religious life and practices of the community. It really is hard to relate how alienating I found all of that. But what is easy to relate is that I had never felt so Jewish in my life. The more my ICA colleagues tried to make me conform to what they believed, the more invisible and excluded I felt. And that sense of exclusion was only compounded by the fact that I also identify as bisexual. On numerous occasions, I remember thinking, you have absolutely no idea who I am, and I'm afraid to tell you. As kind and well-meaning as they were, it became clear to me that there was no room in their community for anyone who was not Christian and heterosexual. So it's probably not surprising that our shared status as outsiders led me to bond with the only other non-Christian member of the staff, a young Kenyan Muslim woman about my own age, who left the project soon after I did. I think that all of us have a powerful desire to be seen, to be known, and to be accepted for who we are. For me, that desire to be known and seen is intensified when the person I want acceptance from is particularly important to me. So here's my second story. When I went to Tanzania, another country in East Africa, 10 years later to do my dissertation research, I spent a lot of time in the countryside doing oral histories. The family I lived with was Catholic, so everyone assumed I was Catholic as well. Among the many people that I came to know, respect, and care about, one person stands out. That was a local priest, Father Chiha. To this day, I consider him to be one of the most profoundly compassionate human beings I have ever had the privilege to know. When my research was complete and I was ready to leave Tanzania, I decided that I was no longer comfortable with what I recognized was in essence lying by omission to Father Chiha. So one day, I said that I had something important to tell him, that I wasn't a Christian but a Jew, and that I didn't believe in Jesus Christ. And then I held my breath and waited to see if I would be accepted or rejected by this person who had come to mean an awful lot to me. A few seconds passed while he thought about all of that. The best translation of what he then said to me is, "That's okay, so long as you're not a fanatic about it." And I let out my breath, smiled, and thought, yeah, we say the same thing about you. Embedded in that exchange were the first steps towards genuine belonging, acceptance, and inclusion. For educators, inclusion means more than diversity statements on our syllabi. It means more than telling our students to come and find us during office hours. It means being honestly curious about our students as people, about their life experiences, their aspirations, and their challenges. It means interacting with them without bias or judgment and without preconceived notions of who they are or who they should be. It means caring about them, encouraging them, and being someone who will always listen to them with an open mind. It means treating them the way we ourselves would like to be treated, with compassion, understanding, and acceptance. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Margot. I'm going to bring us home. So I think when we talk about DEIA, we often slur those letters together, and we don't pay enough time talking about each one and how they are different. And what you heard was an example of how they are different for different minoritized populations at Saddleback College. For our LGBTQIA population, we actually do not have significant gaps in achievement. That's because, in many hypotheses, of overcompensation, that we who identify as LGBTQ work our butts off to make sure that while we may not be accepted, we're going to achieve and we're going to make something of ourselves. And perhaps it's not a coincidence that you will be hearing, we hope you will attend a panel of LGBTQ leaders in our district on Thursday, and the panelists will include several familiar LGBTQ identifying leaders in our district, including myself, Vice Chancellor Viscachil, and my brother-in-arms, John Hernandez from IVC. So here we have a group, LGBTQIA group, that identifies and may be comfortable with itself in an environment where it may not necessarily feel comfortable and welcome and belonging. With our Hispanic groups, we find the opposite. And this is not just a phenomenon at Saddleback, but it is a phenomenon nationwide. So if I can talk to you a little bit and bring just a couple little bit of data bits into this, I think this will start at a starting point where Margot left off with the LGBTQIA plus population and relate it back to some of the few things that Gina talked about earlier today. So for us at Saddleback College, if you take apart this DEIA concept and look just at diversity, the question of whether we are sufficiently diverse in our student population could be answered by whether we match the population of our community, which for South Orange County is 20% Latino-Latina. We exceed it. And well, we should, because as you go younger in the population, we see more people of color. So we should be exceeding the population as a whole, or whether we're matching the population in feeder districts, which is 30% Latino-Latina. So for us, currently at about 27, 28%, we're right about where we would expect to be relative to CUSD and SVUSD, our two major feeder districts. One might argue that those are telling signs. That is the future. They are always going to be a few points ahead of us because we are going to see growth in the younger populations of brown and black students that will then be coming to college later. So we're doing pretty well. We should be patting ourselves on the back in terms of diversity. Same thing. Access. So our accessibility. One of the measures that we've been using for accessibility, because it tells us whether language and finances and other barriers are getting in the way, is what percentage of our students who apply at CCC Apply actually enroll in classes. And traditionally, about 5 years ago, this was about 50% or less. And we worked very hard to increase it. And we have increased it. You can see that for all students, we've increased it to 57%. And if we had language barriers, if we had a lot of barriers that were getting in the way of Latina students coming to Saddleback, we would expect a gap. And indeed, we used to have a more significant gap for this population. But that gap has been taken down to almost nothing. So in accessibility, we're doing pretty well. Inclusion. So Margot did a very good job distinguishing inclusion from the typical outcome achievement normal metrics that we talk about. This one has to be looked at separately. So do our black and brown students feel like they belong here? Do they feel that they would recommend this college to other people? And how does that compare to white non-Hispanic students? When we look at this data, we have several points to look at, surveys. We do some national data, we do national surveys, including HEADS and RISC, and we do our own survey. We recently did a student climate survey. So our climate survey and all these various survey colleges asked together, so you can see for all credit students, 88% satisfaction with Saddleback, pretty darn close to that for our Latinx population. For how likely are you to recommend Saddleback College, 95% actually exceeds it for our Latinx population. And finally, do you feel a sense of belonging? We asked the question directly. Do you feel a sense of belonging? White students, 83%. Our Latinx students, 88%. So inclusion gaps for LGBTQIA populations, but not so much achievement gaps. For our Latinx populations, we seem to be doing pretty well and have eliminated most of the inclusion gaps. But let's look at equity. So the normal measurements that we look at equity, we've talked about these before, completion of transfer level math, course success rates, transferring to four-year institutions. I'm going to focus on just one. Just one. Let's just focus on one piece of data this semester. Let's just talk about course completion, because the more courses we can get our students through, the more likely they are to do all those other things. The more likely they are to achieve transfer level math or English as that course, the more likely they are to persist, the more likely they are to complete, the more likely they are to actually transfer. So we have the same equity gap in achievement for our Latinx students just about as when I first started here 5 years ago. It was about 7% then, it's about 6% now. Same achievement gap. So is it that they don't feel like they belong here? Nope, we looked at inclusion gaps. Is it that we've created accessibility problems? Are there language problems? Nope, we don't seem to have those kinds of gaps. We're doing everything right, but just one little thing, actually achieving the outcomes that we want to for them and facilitating their success. So do we have servingness? Are we an HSI? Yes, in so many ways that we're doing well. But my ask of us this semester and going forward is to just work on this one thing. And the thing about this is, if we can close this gaps as other institutions have for our Hispanic students, if we can close that -6 gap in course completion, I promise you, because I've seen it in all of the data, we will raise course completion for all students. We will lift all boats. The practices that work for students of color will lift all boats. They will make all students more successful and narrow equity gaps simultaneously. So all students will be served, not just Hispanic students, by focusing on this. And finally, I want to end with this note. Spring is a time of renewal. It is a time when the days get lighter. It is a time when we begin to see the fruits of our gardening and the fruits of our labor. It is a time when we think about who we are and what we are as an institution. And it is a time when we renew all of the things that matter to us. Recently, not too recently, but last April, my husband, as some of you know who are close to me, announced that he was going to retire from work. And he retired from work. And this was partly because his mom, my mother-in-law, has become more ill, and she's had a couple strokes and needs more help, and he just couldn't do it with a full-time job. And also, he just felt ready to retire. He didn't want to find a part-time job. He felt ready to retire. And I'll tell you, I was a little worried. I was like, yeah, I'm not sure you've got enough hobbies. I'm not sure you've got enough to go there. But you know, you don't argue with your spouse when they're pretty sure this is something they want to do, and he felt ready to do it. And he did it, and a few months later, he came to me, he was struggling a little bit, and he said, okay, I admit it, I'm floundering. And I've thought a lot about what that means and why he floundered and why he failed to stick the landing in retirement. Because I think this is a bigger story than retirement. I think we all need purpose. And I think for a while he has struggled in retirement to find that purpose. Our students need purpose. Our students find purpose in their career goals. Our students find purpose in becoming smarter about the world and better critical thinkers. They find purpose in guided pathways by finding a school that directs them to something that they can see, that they can wrap their arms around, as opposed to not being sure where they want to go or what they want to find. So I think purpose is important to our students, but I also think purpose is important to us. So here's what I want to share with you at the start of a new year, at the start of a semester, and as we begin our own spring renewal. We are extremely fortunate, and here's why. We all have a purpose if we just remind ourselves of it from time to time. Our purpose is not ourselves. Our purpose is not the beautiful buildings that we will build. Our purpose is not our initiatives. Satisfaction will never come from being more successful ourselves or for bringing more attention to the work that we do or to ourselves. Our purpose is these folks. Our purpose is our students. And we remind ourselves when we focus on our students and make more of them successful, all of them successful, that we have purpose and that what we do is important. And nothing is more satisfying or crucial to be happy on our jobs and happy on our lives. So this spring, I ask us at a time of renewal to focus on our students, to making more of them successful, to focusing on course completion for our Hispanic students as a way of lifting course completion and success for all of our students. So happy spring semester, happy 2024, happy New Year. Glad we're all together. Have a great semester.